guesses, if they had continued to reproduce, they would have had a population of some 200 million instead of 30 million by the time of the Battle of Adrianople. That means they would have fielded an army of 6 or 7 times larger than the one they actually fielded. Guess what? I don't think the Germans would have fought. Then, right after the Battle of Adrianople, Attila the Hun came in from Mongolia. Attila the Hun was basically a coward. When you stood up to him, he was ready to commit suicide. I don't think Attila the Hun would have fought if the Romans would have had an army as big as they should have had. The Roman army wound up becoming a bunch of hired soldiers, which we have not. Well, we're doing the same thing, hiring soldiers. But the Roman army was mostly foreign. Well, why didn't they hire Latin? Why didn't they hire Roman people? Because the Roman people had not been born. Or if they had been born, they'd been put out in the woods to die. There were not enough of them left to fill the Roman ranks. All right. Why did the Roman Empire fall? All right. Marcus Aurelius was the last of 5 good emperors. I've already mentioned him once. Up until his time, for the last 100 years before him, Rome had been climbing steady. And if that climb could have continued, Rome would still exist to this day. Europe would be a united Europe. That might not necessarily be good, but Europe would be united. Well, what happened? During the days of Marcus Aurelius, a big fire occurred. Earthquakes occurred. Famines began to come on the scene. And the population started to dwindle. It was not necessarily Marcus Aurelius' fault, but he couldn't help the fire. He didn't start it, not like what they say Nero did. The earthquake certainly was not his fault. The storms were not his fault. But the empire began to suffer reverses. What was to blame? The cyclical pattern where the sun warms up and cools down. The sun warms up and cools down every 300 or so years. And in spite of the fact that we've had one of the hottest falls on record so far, I still think that an ice age might be around the corner. Because we're due. We had one in the 1680s, we had one in that before the 1300s. Beyond that, it's a little bit harder to guess, to tell what the temperature was. But I think that there was a cooling down, but we'll see this when we come to China in a few minutes. All right. Unlike the other ones, Marcus Aurelius was followed by his son Commodus. I'm not going to write Commodus' name down. He will not be on the test. But I want to state this, Commodus was such a bad man. He set himself up as a god before he died. The other Roman emperors would say that they were not God until after they were dead. Commodus said he was God when he was alive. Then Commodus gave himself 12 names, then set up a calendar that had 12 months. Every one of the 12 months were his names. Now, Commodus' calendar did not exist after he died. The people finally became really upset at him and rose up and killed him. Then, one of the most disgraceful acts in Roman history occurred. In picking, well, who's going to be the next emperor? Commodus hadn't picked one. The other emperors had picked the next one. So what they do? They put the empire up for auction, the office of emperor up for auction. The man who bid the highest got it. The man who bid the highest was a man named Septimus Severus. He started the Severan dynasty. Again, you might notice I'm not writing that name down. But the Severan dynasty at least brought some order to Rome temporarily. But when the last Severan emperor had passed on, Rome was to go through 50 years of chaos. During that time and 50-year period, only one emperor actually died a natural death. He was in his 80s when he got the job of emperor, though, already. They had 24 emperors in 50 years. And all of them were killed except for the old man, who didn't last long anyway because he was already old. Anyway, finally, after this chaos, there came an emperor named Diocletian. Diocletian brought about a period of stability. Now, he also carried out a war that he didn't start, but now, again, folks, this was something that I've been mentioning in my paper that I did 54 years ago. I've lost the paper along the way, but I still remember most of what I wrote because I had to write with an old beat-up manual typewriter, and I'm a lousy typist, so I wish I could have had. I mean, I would dream of a word processor which did not exist today. But I used to dream, oh, if only I had. I'd realized that a sentence I put down could be reconstructed, but to reconstruct in those days meant I had to retype the whole page. And that's hard when you're a lousy typist. Typing along, and after you get to the end, the bell will ring and let you know that you'd better. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, a few of you. All right. Oh yeah. My wife and I finally took all our old manual typewriters to the electrical didn't work. Leaving it. All right. But one of the things, though, that Rome fought a whole series of wars against a revived Persian Empire. And guess what? The United States is fighting a long series of unending wars. The longest wars in history were the wars that there was the war that Rome fought against Persia. It lasted some 500 years. Ended with Persia finally being defeated. They just simply would not fight a decisive fight and really, really whip the Persians. They play fought. This was something that was not going on. Of course, in my day, there was a Vietnam War going on, and it lasted a long time. But none of our wars, except for our Indian wars, have lasted as long as the wars that we're now fighting in the Middle East. Anyway, Diocletian went over to the Middle East. Now, another thing Diocletian did, he divided the empire into four. Into four sections. He said the empire is really tough, and he said to the four men he picked to be the king over each section, you take care of yourself as best as you can, because the empire is just too big for one man to manage. Now, this was to eventually lead to the empire being split. The one man I want you to remember, and I'll write his name down in a few minutes, one of the men he picked was a man named Constantine. Not the Constantine you're familiar with, but it was our Constantine. The Constantine you probably heard about, it was his father. Constantine, the father, was picked to be ruler over the British Isles, Great Britain, and Northern Gaul, basically the northwest part of the empire. All right. Then Constantine made a law that every man must take up the profession of his father. That meant if your father were a blacksmith, you had to become a blacksmith whether you wanted to or not. Now, your father might have been the best blacksmith in the state or in the province, but that did not mean that you could do the job yourself. It might mean that you'd be exposed to it and get some training in it. Or your father might have been the best general around, but that didn't mean that you could command troops. Nevertheless, he believed, here's his purpose. He was afraid that if he allowed men to pick their occupation, that there'd be too many men in one occupation and not in another. I wish I could go back and say, hey, Mr. Diocletian, your Majesty, if you just leave the men alone, they'll all find their occupation. And in my day, every American boy wanted to be a Major League Baseball player, and let's face it, most of us didn't have the ability. So we wound up waking up to reality. We found our niche. If you just leave the men alone, they'll find their niche by the market system. And if there's too many blacksmiths, well, some of them will be forced out of business, and hey, when they're forced out, they'll take up something else. And most of you in your lifetime, I don't mean to sound pessimistic, most of you are going to wind up being laid off at one point or another. It's natural. Don't think it only could happen to me. No, it happens to almost everybody. You're going to wind up being laid off. I was. Actually, I was laid off this spring. minutes from here, but I came back. I went to Lowe's, construction store, and worked for Lowe's during the months of February, March, April, May, and into June. Then said I had a job, found me another job. Basically, I got my old job back and quit. Why didn't I stay? Because Lowe's wants you to be available 7 days a week. Not, just say back. 7 days a week, 364 days a year. You know, I said 364. They give you off at Christmas time. The rest of the time, they're expected to be available. And, so I quit. Anyway. But, no, anyway. He told his men that they also, he tried to regulate wages and prices to prevent inflation. Worst thing you could have done. What's so bad about it? Well, let's face it. If we'd had a president who regulated car prices in 1910, cars would be really, really crummy today, and by our standards, as crummy as they were in 1910. In 1910, you just hope your car would start when you approached it, especially because it got a little bit older. Just, I hope this thing would start today. I don't know what I'll do if it doesn't. When Uncle Sam, Uncle Sam, that's the name for a government, bought the first cars, if they wouldn't run, the sales, you can hitch a mule right here in the front of it. Hitch a mule and the mule will take you where you want to go. This actually happened. I'm saying this, without the ability to improve and innovate. Now, today's cars are better, but they're also more expensive. What about health care? If we had 1910 health care, 1910 health care was cheap, and it was highly ineffective by today's standards. 2018 health care is effective, but it is not cheap. Not at all. But again, he didn't realize. Again, Diocletian wrote about keeping wages constant and inflation, folk, is a sign of progress. You have to allow wages to go up. You have to then allow prices to go up because manufacturers are going to put out better products. Hopefully, anyway. Basically, I wish I could tell Diocletian to leave the market alone. It'll take care of itself. You might learn this in economics class, hopefully. All right. Now, finally, here's where he made his biggest mistake, though. He was not so enthused about it first, but some of his top advisors told him, Mr. Diocletian, there's a group of people rising really fast. You've got to get rid of them. You've got to wipe them out. They were talking about the Christians. So Diocletian did the most energetic persecution of Christians that was done by any emperor with the intent to wipe the Christians out. Now all of us in here, I'm sure, know that he failed miserably. By the end of his reign, the empire was more Christian than it had been at the beginning of his reign. Also, the man he had picked to take care of the northwest quadrant of his empire, Constantine by name, simply did not follow his order, and Diocletian was too busy fighting in Persia to do anything about it. That meant that in 1/4 of the empire, there was no persecution of Christians. Also, your local magistrates oftentimes would not take up the cause either. And again, the emperor was too busy to deal with it. So keep in mind, notice, communication was slower than it is today, and it was more difficult. I mean, the emperor could not get in on his airplane and fly and say to a magistrate, you persecute Christians. I mean, it wasn't that simple. Anyway, a lot of the Christians were not persecuted, but the ones who were, he made life miserable for them. But again, his attempt to eradicate Christianity was a complete, total, utter flop by any standards at all of success or failure. It failed. Well, finally, the people of Rome did something they had never done before. They didn't kill him, but they told him, Mr. Diocletian, you're in ill health. We think you ought to go home and sit down and retire. And at that point, Diocletian did what no other emperor had done. He went home, sat down, and retired. In other words, he was still alive, but no longer emperor. In some ways, this was an improvement. Well, when Diocletian retired, civil war followed. his 4 appointees fought among themselves. But this time, the first Constantine was dead, so the son, Constantine II, took over. The son. Constantine, well, to make long story short, 4 men fought. 2 of them fought each other, and then the other 2 fought. You might call it a tournament, like we're having in baseball playoffs right now. 4 teams will eventually survive, and they'll whittle down to 2. Now, you had Constantine and the other man. Constantine won his first fight. Then he was facing a second one. Now, when I played high school football, I overheard, well, the quarterback called a play. The play gained several yards. The assistant coach said to the head coach, that was a bad call. The head coach said back to him, any play that works is a good call. I have spent the rest of my life thinking about that. Is that always true? What if a quarterback calls a crummy play that actually works? Was it a good call or not? Well, if it worked, maybe it was a good call, but I'll leave it at that. Anyway, Constantine made what appeared at first to be a really bad call. Well, he had a dream the night before the battle. In a dream, he saw a vision. The vision was a sign of a cross in the sky. And above the cross are the words in Latin, by this sign you will overcome, or by this sign you will conquer. Constantine woke up convinced that he should become a Christian. He had his men put crosses across their shields, paint crosses pasted on the shield, or sew crosses real hurriedly on their front of their chest. All this took a little bit of time. Then he went into battle under the cross of Christianity, which by almost any reasonable way of reckoning, it was a bad move, except for one thing, he won the battle and became emperor. Well, and one of his first acts as emperor was to issue the Edict of Toleration. I'm not going to write it down, but it won't be on the test. The Edict of Toleration, which made Christianity legal. Then later, after he was gone, Christianity became the official religion of the empire. Paganism was dead. I have to say that tongue-in-cheek because a lot of persons will say, no, paganism simply took on Christian names and survived. Jupiter became St. Peter. Isis became Mary. Osiris became Jesus, so on and so forth. And paganism then rode on the back of Christianity, but under a different name. But be that as it may, at least for the moment, it appeared that paganism was dead and Christianity had triumphed. Took a few hundred years. Now this, I don't have emphasized dates very much, but I must emphasize this one. Constantine became emperor in 312 CE. Very important. Now, unfortunately though, when Constantine took over, he followed Diocletian's policy of having all the men follow the profession of father. He also followed his policy of controlling wages and prices, or trying to. Now, but he did something else that was to have far-reaching effect. He moved his capital from Rome to Constantinople. He named the city after himself. Constantinople. Now today Constantinople is called Istanbul. It's still there. Constantinople was located along the Black Sea. But he found a well-fortified place where the Black Sea is really narrow. Anyway, and set up his capital. Now, more than 50 years ago, Kellogg's Cornflakes used to advertise, and they'd say, what is the corniest city in the world? Well, the corniest city in the world was Constantinople, but they changed its name to Istanbul. Ear is in cornea. Anyway, that might help you remember it. All right, that might help you remember it. It changed its name. All right, anyway, Constantine moved the capital. What this did was, it was the start of an empire that was to later be known as the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire lasted 1,000 years before finally being overrun by the Muslims. Keep this in mind because we'll be talking more about the Byzantine Empire when we come to chapters 12 and 13. When the Byzantine Empire fell, it was said to be the end of the medieval history and the beginning of modern. All right. Except for one emperor after Constantine, they all were Christian. There was one named Julian, whom they called Julian the Apostate. A lot of your leaders did not really show any interest in making the empire Christian, and a lot of them secretly worshiped the old gods. Nevertheless, as time went on, more and more of them fell in step and became Christian also. Now, Constantine was not the ideal Christian, and I've had more than one person ask me, was Constantine really genuinely converted? When I took my master's test, I had to read 12 books, and one of them was about Constantine, where that author believed that Constantine's conversion was genuine. But I want to tell you, he had a couple problems. His mother, Helena, went down to Israel to find the old places where Jesus had lived and worked, and she supposedly found Jesus' birthplace, the place of Jesus' crucifixion, the place of Jesus' tomb. A lot of persons since have said that we don't know if she was right or not. Keep in mind, more than 270 years had passed, maybe no more like 280 years had passed, and nobody alive could tell them exactly where these things were. But eventually, Helena, because she was so domineering and so oppressive, Constantine had her killed. Now, he was not the only emperor who had his mother killed. But now, worse than that, and folks, this is going to remind some of you of 2018. His son was accused by one of Constantine's wives of having had an affair with her, and on the basis of the accusation, only with no proof, he had this son executed. Basically, you're guilty until proven innocent. This was not the way Roman justice was supposed to work. Now, I want to say this now about this fathers killing their sons. This was not to happen again among kings until Peter the Great killed his son around 1720. From 315 or so, when Constantine killed his son, until Peter the Great killed his, you don't find very many instances, if any, of a king or even a high nobleman. It just wasn't done in Western Europe until after the time of Peter the Great. And even but before that time, it was a common practice among the Romans. In the short run, Constantine, like Diocletian, brought some stability to the empire. In the long run, these policies did not work. Oh yeah, something else that both men did that I must mention. Bureaucracy. These men set up bureaucracies Now, a bureaucracy, where you have one man at the head, and underneath him are some subordinates. The army is basically a bureaucracy. You have the general. Under the general, you have the lieutenant generals. Under the lieutenant general, you have the major generals. Under the major general, you have the brigadier generals. Under the brigadier general, you have the colonels. Under them, the majors, etc., etc. Hierarchy of authority, a pyramid like authority. Well, Constantine and Diocletian did the same thing with civilian life. They had civilian bureaucracies as well as military. The problem was the bureaucracies to pay for the workers, they had to tax the people heavily. Now, I remember this from my 6th grade world history book. A little limerick, it was a cartoon, and it showed a man just under the weight of a heavy, heavy burden. And you could tell it was inside his sack was a bunch of money, coins. And the caption said, "Heavy taxes, most of all, caused the Roman Empire's fall." The taxation was really heavy, especially since there were fewer and fewer people at this time to pay it, to keep up the bureaucracy and to keep up the military. Basically, folk, they were running out of people, and yet trying to maintain the same old standard of living. What if all those babies that they had killed would have been allowed to grow up and have more and more children? Now, I had a student tell me, but isn't it true we need to curb our population? That's a deception. The reality is, under the right conditions, people, most individuals, now some are different, but most individuals contribute more than they consume. Therefore, what we need is more people. I mean, if I could go back to the year 1300, I'd tell them, number one, populate like crazy. Well, what's so great about population? Because when you populate, eventually you can build roads, superhighways, automobiles, airplanes, runways, factories. They didn't have enough people to do this. They needed people like crazy. They eventually got them. Now, I said, wouldn't they starve? Hey, I'll tell you something. We have far more people than we had in 1300, and a lot of us have problems with food. Yes, I do. It's obvious. The problem I have with food is I have too much of it, not too little. Oh, yes, it's nothing that I don't see any of you who look like you're starving. I mean, hardly any of you. In fact, I don't see anybody look like you're starving. Why? Because since the 13th, we've invented the tractor, the combine, the reaper, whatever else, the automatic milker. All of which, and oh yeah, better ways to grow hogs, better ways to grow chickens, better ways to grow cattle, better diets for livestock, means more and better food. All right. Again, now, then, shortly after Constantine became a Christian, not long after there came the barbarian invasions. It was mostly German people. The Germans divided into Vandals, Goths, there were the Ostrogoths, and Visigoths. I'm going to leave it at this. Now later we'll talk about the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and other people who came along later. And then later on we'll talk about the Scandinavians, the people from Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, these Scandinavian people. But they were to come later. All right, now, what got these Germans to move? Oh, I can't prove it, but I have my suspicions. It was climate change. I suspect the climate cooled, but at the moment it's very difficult to prove it that far back. But I'll leave it with, they did move. They started moving, and they became a real threat to the empire. The Germans, to meet the Romans, to meet the threat, tried to build fortifications and walls and whatever. They were not effective. Basically, the Roman people were dying off. Now, the German people I'm talking about so infiltrated the Roman Empire that after a while there were no more Romans. The Latin language died. It was replaced in Italy by the Italian language, which is related to Latin, but the Latin language